Begin recording. Wait, recording pending. I don't understand what that means. Is it? Oh yeah, now it's recording. Cool.
Yeah, all right. Hey guys.
Yep, Rohan just left. He'll be with us in 1 second. I think he glitched out.
Yeah, no, I pressed the leave call button instead of the participants button. Anyways, yeah, Ahmed Abbas. First question: how many of you were not present for the previous argumentation session? Because I'll be using a lot of vocabulary and stuff from there. So, I need to know if you guys are aware. Anyone that did not come for the previous session? Okay, cool, no worries. This session is mainly about adjudication. I mainly cover Asian Parliamentary. It's not very like it's the basics, but and then I'll extend a bit into BP as well. I'll tell you when that happens. So, first question is, what is adjudication? Obviously, adjudication is basically you're the person who decides who won the debate or lost the debate, and number one, you do that. Number two, you have to convince everyone else. So there are proper metrics on how you understand the debate, how you create teams for the arguments, and how you decide who won or lost. So you use those metrics to evaluate the debate. Obviously, it's still a vague. It's obviously vague. It's not exact science that you have to do steps A, B, C, and then perfect verdict will come out. But you have to do that. You have to be able to convince everyone else. So either you'll have to convince other adjudicators, or in how Asian Parliamentary works out is every adjudicator has to give a 7-minute speech. It's a bit more complicated for PP. I'll come to that later, but you have to give a 7-minute speech to all teams, talking about who won the debate, why did they win the debate, what the teams could have done better, and a lot of basically give them feedback on the debate, right? And explain your own verdict why you think a particular team won, and that's very important. So both teams will mark you based on that, and that's how adjudicator rankings work, because there's also a best judge award and all of that. So if you want to breaking is basically qualifying to the knockout rounds of a competition. So if you want to do all of that, obviously you need to be good, which means you need to know how to adjudicate well and explain to teams why you think which person won or lost. Is the gist of adjudication. Um, how do you adjudicate debate? So I hope you all understand how AP works, the normal AP format. Is everyone okay with that? Just let me know if you're not. Cool, great. So everyone understands what the AP format looks like. There are 3 speakers on each side. Um, First of all, let's. There are multiple things called comparatives. Comparatives is basically when you're judging a team, you don't judge them based on whether they were great, like good, or they were bad. You judge them how did they do compared to the other team, which means debate is again about which team is better, not necessarily which team is good, because both teams can be good or both teams can be bad. You don't award win or losses based on that. You award wins or losses based on which team you think did considerably better, right? And that's the important thing. So I'll come to this is called comparatives, and I'll come to it later. But let's just talk about arguments in general. So teams will obviously try to argue things, and you need to know, like, you need to assess whether those arguments were good or bad, right? So first thing, how do you assess whether an argument is good or bad? Um, like for I talked about this in the argumentation session. Number one, you need to ask yourself, is this argument relevant? Which is to say, if they're making an argument, is it something that's related to the debate? Does it make sense to the side they support? And or does it do anything? Because again, you can prove literally anything you want, but if it's not in relation to the debate, that's very stupid, right? And this might sound obvious now, but sometimes it doesn't come into this plays in a debate in a much more nuanced factor. So it's kind of it gets slightly complicated. So the question is, what they're saying, is it relevant to the debate? That's question number one. Because if they're irrelevant, then everything they say is useless. Number one. Number two, are there any logical jumps? Which is to say, a team will say, okay, I am going to make this argument that proves XYZ. But you need to ask yourself, are they really proving XYZ? Or are there any logical holes in their argumentation? Or could it have been done better? Just give me a sec.
I had a question.
Go on.
Sometimes, like even the adjudicators have some preconceived notions, right? That this side, like they already benefit some side. Then, like, how do we become neutral when you're judging the debates?
Okay. Obviously, it's important to not have, like, not have any preconceived biases towards any side of the motion whenever you're going. Number one, when you're going to debate, keep a neutral frame of mind. I'll come to this when I come to average informed voter. But on any good, the point of good adjudicating is to eliminate any previous biases you have, because every single adjudicator is prone to bias. You are more likely to buy one style of argument because it matches what you understand and your life experience is better. Or suppose like one team from India is debating against one team from say Europe, like England. Then if someone gives Indian relevant examples, you're more likely to buy those examples simply because you understand them, because you have that bias of being Indian yourself. So obviously the point, like, the job of a good adjudicator is to eliminate those biases. That means understanding, like even if you when someone is arguing, understand, hey, I don't want to be too swayed by this simply because I can relate to this better. So if there's a different style of argumentation, you have to give it like equal weightage and equal understanding that you give to a different style of argument. So those preconceived notions, you have to fight those biases, and that's what a adjudicator does. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks.
Uh, All right. Coming back to analyzing the argument. Number one, is it relevant? Number two, have they analyzed properly? So again, if a team tries to prove to you X, Y, Z, and they give you reasoning for why this is likely to happen or why this is an impact, you have to ask yourself: are there any logical jumps? Which means, have they proved it to the fullest extent? Were there some questions which they like? Were there some questions left unanswered? Like, did they actually prove it's going to happen, or is it likely, or did they prove the probability of this happening? So probability, I'll be using the word propensity. Don't get confused. Propensity just means the likelihood. So is what's the propensity for their argument to happen? Or have they proved that this is the best case outcome, or like this is the best thing that people want, and that kind of stuff. So like when they talk about characterization, is this characterization proper, and or like, is it justified in this debate? Is it fair? Those questions. Number three, what's the outcome of the argument? And this is very important. Did they prove in the end? So if there were logical jumps, you'll obviously have to discredit the part of logical jumps, which means they weren't able to prove the argument to the fullest extent. So what were they able to prove, and what were the outcomes? So when you're comparing teams, this is very important, right? Because side A will say, okay, we will have ABC outcomes, and they will other side will say we have DEF outcomes. You need to be able to understand what outcomes were completely proven in this debate, and therefore compare them on the basis of outcomes. Which side had better outcomes? That's the most general definition I can give you of adjudication. Understanding which side proved what outcomes, and on what side of the house are those outcomes better on. So that's number three. Number four is exclusivity, and this is something I talked about in a lot about in the previous workshop, where we basically, exclusivity means if government proves something, they also have to prove it's only going to if they prove a certain benefit, they also have to prove that benefit only exists on their side of the house. Which is to say, if government come up and say, hey, listen, we will have benefits ABC, but opposition come up, hey, guess what, we have the same benefits anyway, regardless of whether the motion exists or does not exist, then it doesn't make sense, right? Those arguments are not very convincing because they didn't prove anything special by. So if the motion were to pass, which is to say if government took the debate, they weren't their word or their paradigm did not have something extra special, simply because those benefits they were able to give are inexclusive. So even if things sound good, once if they're able to prove a lot of good things, you need to ask yourself: is it something that's only happening if the motion passes, or is it going to happen on both sides of the house? And if it happens on both sides of the house, again, these are not very good arguments because they're not really proving anything special, and that's very important. So four things within every argument: number one, relevance; number two, analysis, or like how are there any logical jumps, were they able to prove it properly; number three, outcome; and number four, exclusivity. One way to measure outcome is to ask yourself, did they fix a problem? So they're going to tell, see, this is a problem that exists in the world, and we prove this benefit is going to happen, and that benefit is our outcome. So you ask yourself, what problem did they solve? And if they were able to solve some problem in their paradigm, that was their outcome, right? Uh, and this is very important. Uh, Again, if you want to talk about exclusiveness, if you want to see whether the argument is exclusive or not, measure these outcomes, which is to say, if they proved outcome ABC, ask yourself, do these outcomes exist on the opposition side as well, or are they something unique? So measuring these outcomes is how you measure exclusivity of an argument. Any questions till now? Okay, assuming none. Um, Next thing I want to know want you guys to know about is burdens. Burdens are basically what are the responsibilities of our teams in a debate, which is to say, what is a team supposed to prove and how did they go along proving that. Um, it's very important as an adjudicator, you do not place burdens upon the teams. Like, you do not impose your own burdens on the teams. So like when a debate is starting, you don't have to be like, oh, this team had to prove this or they can't win the debate. That's not what a debate is about, right? When we talked about this in the previous argumentation seminar, we basically we saw three types of burdens, right? Number one, self-imposed burdens, which is to say a team says, I will prove X. Number two, burdens by the motion, which means like if it's a this house regrets motion, they have to give me regret metrics or reasons why they exactly regret this. So that is a burden by the motion. And number three, burdens proposed by the other side, which means if a team proves X, then opposition has a burden to prove that X is not going to happen or X is not a good thing. So if they don't prove that, then obviously the first team wins this argument because they were not able to rebut it properly. So you have the burden of rebutting those arguments and prove. So if some team is able to prove benefit A, again you have or outcome A. So again, think of it in terms of outcomes. If teams are able to prove outcome A, then the other team obviously has its burden to prove that either A is a bad thing or B, A does not exist. Cool. So that's how this happens. So as an adjudicator, please do not assign burdens on any team by saying you have to do this. The things you have to do is number one, understand what burdens are being provided by the motion, and that's what they have to prove in this debate. Number two, that what burdens they themselves have taken, what they tried to prove, basically what they tried to prove in a debate, and then analyze what they were able to actually prove in the debate. Because often teams will tell you that, hey, listen, we're going to prove X, Y, Z, but they don't really prove it to its complete extent. Correct. So you need to understand how much of the argument were they really able to prove, the burdens they took on themselves, and how much of the burden they were able to fulfill. In other words, number three, if the other team was pushing a burden on them, which is if they said, listen, we are going to, which is again, did they rebut that, or if the other team said, okay, you need to prove this to win the debate, was they really able to prove that? First of all, you need to understand, is that burden fair? Number two, this thing. Wait. So is that burden fair? Number two, are they proving it? How do we analyze if burdens are fair or not? Number one, this thing, understand what the burdens of the motion are, which is to say, if I have, I'll take an example. Yeah. Assuming the motion is assuming that technology was available, this house would allow people to erase specific memory of their choice from existence. I think this came for you people only, right? I think this is in part
Yeah,
of
yeah,
December debates.
yeah.
Yeah. So in general, like, government has to prove that if people wanted, they like if people wanted, they were able to erase specific memories of their existence. The burden is not to prove whether this technology is a good thing or a bad thing, or like in general, is it like a morally justifiable? This, it can come up in debate, I'm not saying that, but in general, the motion does not dictate for them to prove this technology is necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, only whether it should be allowed for people to do it or not. So if the teams decide to argue, again, as a adjudicator, you cannot impose burdens, which is to say, if a team argues that, listen, we will debate that's a bad thing and therefore it should not be allowed, that's fine. But the motion does not dictate the fact that whether this thing is a good thing or for the motion does not dictate the burden that you have to prove this is good or a bad thing. You just have to prove should people be allowed to use this or not. Okay, there's a very important difference there. Therefore, number one, understand what burdens are being set by the motion and what burdens they don't have to take up. So government, like teams, don't have to prove everything. They have to prove a particular subsection, and understanding the subsection is very important. Like this example. Point number two, when it comes to burdens are always equal and opposite. So if a team, again, like I talked, if government proves argument X, then the opposition has to prove argument not X, which is to say they can say X is a bad thing, or X, or like X will not happen. The primary burden on opposition is to say X will not happen. The burden is not necessarily to extend that argument and show X is bad in all scenarios, or like okay, this is a bad example, but basically if one team is trying to prove one thing, the burden of the other team is just to disprove that. They don't have to take the extra step and prove why this is necessarily bad in all cases, or why this will always lead to bad outcomes. If they're able to prove just the exact opposite thing from what the other team has proved, that's enough. You don't have to put an additional burden of them to prove extra stuff. That's what it means when burdens are equal and opposite. Does that make sense? Any questions till now? All right. Also, let me know if these things are going over your head because they can be confusing. Also, please make notes because again, a lot of jargon is coming out and it won't stay in your heads. Idea number three, and this is the average informed voter. So, what is the average informed? As an adjudicator, you have to assume the role of an average informed voter. What does this mean? This means this person is knowledgeable in the sense that they have a general idea about everything. However, they have no specialist knowledge. Okay, this means that North Korea is not a democracy. That you understand, like that because that is some level of general knowledge. However, you don't know the intricacies of the North Korean politics, or like Iran is in a trouble zone or is a war zone, but you don't know which factions are fighting and what they're fighting for, etc., etc. So, average informed voter does not have specialist knowledge. So, even if you have the specialist knowledge, you have to discard that. Which is to say, suppose you know Indian politics very well, and or like extremely like very deep workings of the panchayat, for example, and someone says something contradictory to that, you cannot say, "Hey, I have this special knowledge. Therefore, whatever you said is wrong." That it does not work that way. You're not supposed to have that special knowledge. Like you're supposed to leave it aside when you're adjudicator, and you're supposed to be convinced by teams. That's idea one of average informed voter. Number two, an average informed voter is be willing to be persuaded by both sides, which means you listen to arguments from both sides and you take them into consideration and then you decide. This means you cannot have any preconceived notions, which is to say, I think, like personally, I think government thing makes more sense. And before you listening to the arguments, you already decide government makes more sense, and therefore I'm going to I'm going to let government win this debate. So, or maybe you think that this motion is unfair for one side, therefore I'm going to go easy on them. That does not exist. Even if you think the motion is unbalanced, it does not matter. You just have to assess it from what has been spoken, which means you cannot put your own assumptions into it, or you cannot think, you cannot think anything of the motion. You just have to listen to whatever arguments have been made and assess that purely based on the arguments that have been made. If there are very apparent contradictions, like very face value contradictions, if teams say thing X and next thing they or like 2 minutes later they say the exact opposite thing of that, then you can take those contradictions. However, if you have to use some higher level logic to find those contradictions, you cannot do that. For example, if they said thing X and then they said thing Y, and you're like, if X happens, then this will happen, then that will happen, and you draw this whole argument yourself, and you say in the end you prove that that thing Y is not happening. That is, you cannot value that as a contradiction because that's not extremely obvious, right? You can't make arguments for yourself. You cannot make arguments or rebuttals for debaters. So if a person says thing, be like, oh, I can rebut that, therefore I will rebut that and I will not credit that argument. It doesn't work that way. You cannot do that. you have to just listen to those arguments and then assess it on that basis. Was that clear? Okay, no questions. Third thing is the idea, and this is the final thing in average informed voter, is non-interventionism. Non-interventionism is a carry-on from what I was talking about before, where you can't step into the debate yourself and draw conclusions, which means if a team was able to prove X, you can't say, oh, if they were able to prove X, then because of that, I also assume Y is happening, or because logically Y is also happening, therefore I will assume Y. You cannot do that. You cannot create arguments for either teams. You cannot create rebuttals for either teams, which means, again, you only have to judge the debate on the basis of what was said inside the debate and not outside that, right? So you cannot create arguments. So if they prove X, if a team proves X, they only and only prove X. You cannot assume they proved Y because it makes sense from X. Uh, at the same point, you cannot say, oh, if someone made this argument, therefore I have a rebuttal for that, therefore it is not a good argument. That's not how a debate works. You have to wait for the other team. You can see the strength of the argument, which is if and the strength is dependent on the burdens. If they were able to satisfy the burdens, if you think they were not able to satisfy some burden, that's fine. That means that argument is not strong. But you can't say, hey, this argument is weak simply because I can think of a rebuttal to that. That's not how it works. You have to wait for the other team and credit them for the same. Um, that's non-interventionism. And that these three things basically wrap up average informed voter. Does this make sense? Cool. Okay. Feel free. Yeah, go on. Is there any question?
Yeah, I have a small question.
Yeah.
So suppose they prove X, and I know that a direct implication of X is Y, which happens to directly contradict something they said earlier. At this point, if I decide to penalize them, is that interventionism or is that part of my job description?
Yeah, no, that's interventionism. Again, contradictions should only be discredited if there are very crystal clear, or if the second order contradiction, which means you need to create some logical links for yourself and then do it, then it's heavily discouraged from you from taking it down. However, if there were very obvious contradictions, then only you need to do that. Understand that if there are contradictions, other teams will point them out because that's literally their job. So therefore, you have to wait for the other teams to do that and credit them for pointing out those contradictions. However, even though it is their job, even if they miss it, you only have to take down obvious contradictions. As an adjudicator, your job is to only take down the obvious contradictions. And if there are like higher level contradictions, which means you need to draw some logical links to understand them, at that point, that's the job of the teams and not your job to point out. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
And except very obvious. So if the other team wasn't able to point out those obvious, then will they be penalized?
No. They won't be, but you have to take down those arguments. Like if it is very obvious contradiction, then you don't consider it anyway in your adjudication.
But the other team wasn't able to point that out.
That's fine. That means you don't credit the other team. If you were able to credit, like if they were able to point it out, you do credit them for that and you give them extra speaker scores. However, if they were not able to do that, it's fine. Don't That means they were a poor team. However, that argument that government made still does not stand. Do
So
you
if
understand?
team B is able to point out a mistake or a contradiction of team A, then we credit team B and we also discredit team A, like both ways.
No. Okay, there's no crediting and discrediting. So in the end, what's going to happen is you're going to see all the outcomes of a debate and measure which team has better outcomes. So if you credit one team and discredit the other team, you're basically counting that contribution to the debate twice. Don't do that. That simply means team A's arguments are weaker. So if it was an obvious contradiction, you do not consider it, therefore it's weaker. And if team B is able to point it out or not point it out, the argument is still weaker and does not affect whether or which teams wins or not. But however, where this is important is speaker scores. Do you guys know what speaker scores are?
No, I don't know.
All right. So you people are marked for speakers are basically marked for a debate where speaker score ranges from like competition, but usually it's like 69 to 81, where 75 is average, 69 is like the worst speech possible, and 81 is like the best speech possible. So you have to give them marks based on that. So if they were not able to point out the contradiction, they will get lesser marks because that means they're not a good debating team. However, when you analyzing the win-loss, it does not matter if they pointed out or didn't point it out because you have to discredit it as a obvious contradiction.
So we need to give points for every speech from 69 to 81?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
All right. Any other question? Cool.
Somewhat unrelated, but why is it 69 to 81? This seems very arbitrary.
It depends competition to competition. Sometimes it's 50 to 100. Sometimes it's 65 to 85. So it depends competition to competition. There's no this thing. But there are proper scales for it. Don't worry about it. Basically, the idea is 75 is average and you give marks above or below average.
So if a person gives two speeches, say reply speech and this, you have to take the average.
No. You're marking individual speeches, which means you mark every speech differently regardless of the number of times people spoke. Also, reply speeches are half in value, which means if normal speeches are marked out of 69 to 81, this will be marked 34.5 to 40.5.
And POIs? Hello?
Yeah, just give me a sec. Oh, yeah, sorry, my mom was talking to me. You were saying?
Then POIs?
POIs are not marked. POIs are not part of speaking. You don't give on this
But
thing.
if somebody asks a good POI to some country, like some other team, then shouldn't they get the marks for asking something good?
So if it's a good thing, it's probably able to take down the arguments that POIs are questions and attack on the other team, right? If it is a good question, then it'll be able to take down the other team's points. And if it was able to take it down, that means they did not have a good case.
Oh, so
So-
you don't get credit for it, but you can discredit other team.
Yeah, you credit as a rebuttal, but you don't necessarily put it anywhere in the speaker scores.
Okay.
So, like, it can be credited as a rebuttal for the team asking POI?
Yeah, basically.
cool.
So in general, if they have good POIs and stuff, you can give them like a higher speaker score, but there's no exact that, you have to attach it to a single speaker score. Okay, let's continue. What else is an adjudicator supposed to do? You also have to make sure these people are following the rules of a debate, which means because speeches are limited to 7 minutes, anything they say beyond 7 minutes and 20 seconds, you have to ignore. You cannot write it down. Number one. Number two, if new material is brought up in whip and reply, you cannot credit that material, which means whip is not allowed to bring up new constructives. Reply is not allowed to bring up new constructives or new rebuttals, which means if you see any of them, you just ignore them. Cool. So that's what it's supposed to do. You make sure like the rules are kind of enforced, where you take care of that. Also, one more thing wait, I lost my train of thought. Yeah, let's stop there for now. So you basically have to enforce those rules. Second thing, in the case of a contradiction, it's these are sometimes likely to happen. What you do in a contradiction is you discredit the second part of speak. Wait, one sec. I'm so sorry. I have to go. Yeah, I'm so sorry. So yeah, if a team contradicts itself, you have to consider the second part, or you have to discredit the second part of their speech, of their this thing, which means if they say X and then they say not X, you discredit the not X part and you assume X is correct. The only exceptions to this is if number one, they bespoke, they accidentally said X, and then they later say no, we meant not X. Then you obviously discredit the first part because they made like if they misspoke or like said something by accident. That's point number one. Point number two is if all teams agree, if they prove X and then they prove not X, and then all teams in the debate agree to talk about not X, you cannot assume still that X is right and continue with it. You're supposed to measure the debate on how the teams are like how the teams are working and how they're debating. So, which means if everyone agrees that not X is the relevant thing, then the debate will be measured on the basis of not X, and therefore you have to continue on that. Don't mark them for X, and yeah, that's how you judge contradictions. Always credit the first one, unless there's a very valid reason to contribute the other side. So that's it for understanding contradictions. Or what else? Okay, slight brush up on rebuttal and how rebuttal works. We talked about in the last class. Rebuttal works on two levels. Number one, on this thing, direct rebuttal. Number two, mitigatory rebuttal. Okay, there are three types of rebuttal. Last time I told you two, or now the three. First, there is direct rebuttal. Number two, there is mitigatory rebuttal. Number three, there is competing rebuttal. What do each of these mean? Direct rebuttal is basically prove if someone team proves X. Direct rebuttal makes sure that they prove that X is wrong or X is a bad thing. If you're able to take down a complete argument, that is called a direct rebuttal. That's point number one. Number two is mitigatory rebuttal. Mitigatory rebuttal is if a team proves something, you say A, this is not very likely to happen, or all of the benefits, all the outcomes they say from that argument are not likely to happen, which means they don't take down the complete argument, but they take down some portion of that argument. So if they take down like 70% of the argument instead of the whole argument, that means you only credit the remaining. That means the argument which was initially made still stands. However, it is not as strong of an argument as it was supposed to be. It's a slightly weaker argument than it once was, but however, you still credit that argument. A mitigatory rebuttal only takes some portion of it down. Number three is competing rebuttal. So a competing rebuttal is basically if a team proves that we are going to have outcomes X, Y, Z, opposition can come up, listen, we disagree with the motion, we will implement this different thing that will also have outcomes X, Y, Z, or like not X, Y, Z, or will have these level of outcomes, which means the way they're rebutting this is not by saying, hey, listen, you're wrong, but they rebut this by saying, hey, listen, we have something better. At that point, you have to judge whether, again, you have to judge this like a normal argument. Is it exclusive? Is it relevant? And all of that. And then you assess the outcomes. Which team was able to prove what all outcomes, and on which side of the house were the outcomes better off. So a competing rebuttal doesn't directly clash, like doesn't directly prove the other team wrong, but still clashes with that argument by proving that another alternative way an alternative rebuttal is going to be much better in uh, like an alternate argument is going to be much better in accomplishing all the outcomes that other team wants. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm hoping it does. So what happens in the end, again, how do you adjudicate a debate? Correct. So first of all, you have to understand all the arguments. You have to understand the framing and the metrics given a debate. There's something you went over in the previous session again. Metric is basically, framing and metric is generally teams tell you, listen, the most important stakeholder is this, and the way we should measure this debate is through this way. Like we want this particular stakeholder to be the best of or have the maximum utility, or they're like some team can say we want poor people to be better off. That's the metric for this debate. Or on a different thing, if it's an actor motion, then they will say, listen, this is the actor, this is what the actor wants, and they will say XYZ goals of the actor, and then they will give arguments proving why those goals are fulfilled on their side of the house. So the metric for this debate is where is the actor better off based on those goals. So that is basically a metric. They will give you a way to, basically teams are supposed to give you a way to evaluate the debate as to what the problem we have to solve in this debate and how they're solving those problems by giving outcomes. So pay attention to that, number one. Number two, pay attention to what constructors they have given you. Number three, pay attention to what rebuttals you are giving you and how much they weaken the other team's case. In the end, obviously, for an AP, you'll have leftover stuff, correct? Like after that, understand what all is left over. So arguments that were completely not taken down, or B, arguments that were not rebutted. So whatever is remaining in the debate after all 8 speeches have happened, you analyze that. You obviously, if the teams gave you a metric, then you look at it via the metric, which team was able to prove what, like according to the metric, which team was better off. You compare the outcomes. Also understand, when you're comparing outcomes, it does not mean you compare the number of outcomes, which means you can't say, hey, listen, this team had 3 arguments, the other team has 2 arguments, therefore 3 wins because more number. That's not how adjudicating works. Don't do that. Quantity does not matter. Understand which side has better outcomes inside, in the sense that which paradigm is better, which team has benefits that are more better, and you understand, like you quantify this better based on the metrics they have given you. So if one team is able to prove that poor people, this in the metric is we want to make poor people better off, and they give 3 arguments on how poor people will be better off. Opposition says, opposition gave me 2 arguments how poor people will be worse off. Then you try to compare this and understand on which side of the house are these poor people better off. Necessarily, if opposition's 2 arguments are able to take down all the show that all the outcomes on government side are bad, then you give it to opposition because they were able to prove this is going to make people significantly worse off, and that's a metric for this debate. And similarly, if government were able to prove through the metric of the debate that people will be better off in their side, then you give them the debate. So you have to compare, and this is what a comparative is, where basically one team will paint you one picture and the other team will paint you one picture. You need to understand that which picture is better for the concerned people, for the concerned metric, and then you award them the debate. Am I making sense? Okay, cool. I guess no questions.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess no questions then. So just to summarize, you base a debate on the outcomes, which team was able to prove like which outcomes are best and worst based on the metric. If the teams do not give you a metric, assume the most standard metric you can. So if the debate is about minorities, or like if it's an LGBT debate, then obviously assume where LGBT people are better off, or basically try to find the most basic and the obvious metric in the debate, and tell the teams, hey, listen, no metric was given in this debate, therefore I judged the debate via this metric, and here is what I think, and then give them the reasoning. That's pretty much it for Asian Parliamentary. Any questions?
If we consider only MUNs, then are we supposed to credit or discredit right to replies?
Bro, this is not
Wait.
MUN. This is
Yeah,
not
MUNs aren't
MUN.
related. This is Asian
Yeah.
Parliamentary.
This is parliamentary debates. This is not related to MUN at all.
Okay, so we can't apply these things to MUNs? Like,
No, you
that's also a debate.
MUNs almost very different from this in terms of judging.
Oh, okay.
I've never
Nice.
judged an MUN or did an MUN in my life, so I can't tell you. Aren't they
You
very
have to
different?
take my word for it. It's different. It's very different from this.
Okay, thanks Raghav, thanks Rohan.
Cool.
No worries. Anything else? Any questions related to AP and judging in AP?
Yeah, I have one. How much does role fulfillment actually matter while judging?
Okay. Role fulfillment does not matter at all, in the sense these are just guidelines for people to follow. Role fulfillment is important, as in Web cannot bring up new points or reply cannot bring up new points. So role fulfillment, in that case, you just discard those points. But role fulfillment is just basically guidelines. You don't punish teams or give them an advantage for not necessarily doing role fulfillment. These are just guidelines on how to make your argumentation better. In the end, you just assess which team had better arguments, not necessarily how they got there. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
So in that sense, if the whip introduces a new point, am I supposed to credit it or not?
No. Those are proper rules. They're proper rules. Like reply cannot bring up new points. For example, a whip cannot bring up new points. Then you completely discredit those. You don't give those points there. I'm talking about softer things, like role fulfillment. Like DPM is supposed to elaborate on, DPM has like two roles, right? Elaborating on PM speech and rebutting leader of opposition. So if they don't rebut a leader of opposition, for example, but government web comes up and gives excellent rebuttals to everyone else, you don't necessarily punish the team because, hey, DPM did not bring up any rebuttals. So I meant that by role fulfillment, you don't have to give them points or remove points based on that role fulfillment. There is guidelines. However, there are particular rules, like you can't bring up new arguments in whip and reply. Those you have to, those arguments you have to discredit. Does that answer your question, Shashwat?
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
All right. Anything else related to AP? Cool. I think it's a lot of experience-based thingy. So you will get it with time. Don't worry. You'll have to do a lot. The next thing is oral adjudication, which is again in AP, every person has to give a 7-minute speech. So people have different styles of doing it. I'm not going to give you a style, but in general, you have to tell a team which team won. You have to give your reasons why you think the team won. So again, you can do it in multiple ways. You can tell them what you thought the burdens in this debate were, how they fulfilled them, how whether their arguments were relevant. So basically, how you credited those arguments, why you credited them, or why you felt those arguments were bad or missing. You can explain that. You compare it to the other teams. You tell them that what you think government were able to prove. You tell them what opposition were able to prove, and in the end, why you think government or opposition won the debate, and what reasoning there was. So there's also something called constructors. Constructors are basically telling a team how they could have done better in the debate, or what arguments they could have run the debate. Again, a debate is not based on what arguments they could have run, or what is or like what they could have done extra. Debate is just based on what these teams have already argued. So you, as an adjudicator, you can help them become better people. That's the point of adjudicating, helping teams become better teams by helping them understand how they won and lost. So you can do that after. You can just do that. You can talk to them after when you're taking feedback. Don't give constructors. However, you have to talk about the comparative in the debate, as in you have to tell the teams what government proved, what opposition proved, and why comparatively government or opposition why the winning team did a better job in this debate, and what they did better, and what metrics were used to assess how they did better. That's what you have to explain during your 7 minutes. Any questions? Cool. Okay. Moving on. Next thing I'll do is British Parliamentary. Just give me a sec.
Can you also just go through the format of British Parliamentary? I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, sure, of course.
Thanks.
Okay, WADC is very complicated, so you want to understand first go, but I'll just quickly tell you. All right, sharing screen. Okay, so and this is very competition related, right? How does judging in AP competition work? In an AP wait, where is this? Okay, yeah, okay. In judging an AP competition, whenever you judge a competition, you are assigned one of three roles. You're either trainee, your panel, or your chair. Cool. In Asian Parliamentary, regardless of who you are, as in trainee panel chair, you still have to give a 7-minute speech. How Asian Parliamentary works is it's based on a majority vote, which is to say, if 4 people vote for, it's usually, first of all, it's odd numbered. Number two, if 2 people vote for government and 1 person votes for opposition, the government automatically win. And that's how Asian Parliamentary works. If you're a trainee, then you do not get a vote. So basically, when they're adding up the votes to see which team won, trainees' vote does not count in that. However, you still have to give a 7-minute speech on the basis you're marked. So trainee is the lowest role. The second lowest role is panel. panel's vote does count, and the highest role is chair. Chair's vote also obviously counts. In AP, the only difference between panel and chair is that the chair, unless the chair is in the minority, voting minority, they're supposed to go last. So the order is trainees go first, then panelists go second, and chair goes last. The only exception is if there is a voting minority, that trainees will always go first, then the voting minority will go, then the voting majority will go on the same panel first, and then chair second order if the chair is the majority. I hope that makes sense. It's different for British parliamentary. How British parliamentary works is, again, there are chairs, panelists, and or trainees. However, in this, only the chair delivers the feedback. So at the end of a debate, all the adjudicators will go to a separate room. They will have a 15-minute discussion and try to argue on the rankings. So BP has 4 teams: opening argument, opening opposition, closing argument, closing opposition. So you have to give a ranking of 1, 2, 3, 4. At that point, all judges will have a 15-minute discussion. They will try at the end of 15 minutes, they will try to reach a consensus. However, if they don't reach a consensus, then this will be a thing, dissent. So again, dissent works on majority minority basis. If a majority, whatever the majority votes for, will be the final thing. And a speaker in the majority always gives the feedback. So if the chair is the dissentee, which means they are in the minority, then one of the panelists will give feedback. Again, trainee vote does not count during the discussion or during the voting. So at the end of 15 minutes, if everyone has the same verdict, great. Otherwise, there's a vote. In the vote, trainee's vote does not count. How the marking system works is the chair marks all panelists and trainees. The panelists will mark the chair, and all the teams will also mark the chair, who will give after the feedback. Does that make sense? Any questions till now? All right, this is slightly complicated, but I hope you understood. So basically, the chair will be the only one giving feedback, unlike AP, where every single adjudicator will give feedback. Like adjudicating this thing, BP is very complicated. Honestly, it's very annoying. Like that's the main reason I love BP so much. It's much more complicated because Asian parliamentary, there is 2 teams, and like which team is better than the other team, it's kind of straightforward. BP is much more entertaining than that. Just going with BP general, opening government, opening opposition, this plays out much like an AP, where you have 2 speakers from each team. You have 2 in opening government, you have 2 in opening opposition. So when you're comparing these 2, you just have to treat it like an AP with only 2 speakers, and then you assess that. Closing government has to bring up arguments for government. However, at the same time, they cannot bring up the same material opening government did, which means they have to bring up brand new material. This can be, we talked about this before, this can be in terms of extensions. Extensions can be vertical, which means you take what opening government tried to prove, and if they didn't completely fulfill their burdens, you complete those arguments for them, which means if opening government proved outcome A, but they didn't never prove the propensity of that outcome or how likely that argument is to happen, closing government can come up, hey, listen, opening government didn't prove that, we're going to prove that. And this is their new contribution to the debate. That's called vertical analysis, where you take something that is already argued, but make it a better argument. If they're just rewording it, if they're just using different words to say the same thing, then it's not a new argument, and therefore you don't really credit them. You give them 0 points for that. However, if they were able to add something extra, then you credit them for the argument. That's extension number 2. Extension number 1, that is vertical. Extension number 2 is horizontal, where they bring up brand new points, which they can do, and create brand new arguments. You also credit them for that. Like superhero responsibility, adu hai. Then closing opposition has the same thing, where they have to bring up new points from opening opposition. They obviously have to rebut the other side as well. Same for closing government, they have to rebut the other side as well. So when you're judging a BP, and I can take a whole new session on this, which will take an hour. I might do it sometime later if people are interested. But basically, you have to give a ranking of 1, 2, 3, 4. So you have to compare every team to all other teams, which means when you're comparing opening government, you have to compare opening government and opening opposition. This one you can treat just like a normal AP, and find out who had better outcomes. So opening government that. Then you have to treat opening government versus closing government. Which team do you think had better contributions to the debate? Which team do you think had more relevant arguments? Which team do you think weighed their arguments? Which means which team was able to show the more importance of their arguments? Like which team was able to show that their arguments are more important successfully. So you take which one had better contribution to the debate between opening government and closing government, and then opening government is CEO. Again, what did opening government say? How did closing opposition reply? Obviously, when closing opposition are talking, opening government does not really get a chance to reply except for POIs because they're later. So you have to compare them. What points? How did closing opposition reply to opening government? Did their points still stand, or did they do a good enough job, or were closing opposition able to take their case down?
I have a doubt.
Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting, but
No, sure.
why are we giving different points to opening government and closing government if they're on the same side of the agenda or the motion?
So that's how British parliamentary works, right? There are 4 teams. 2 will argue for the motion, 2 will argue against the motion. But all teams are separate and need to be marked separately.
Oh, okay. So even if they're like working on the same agenda, they're still separate. Like they're
Yeah.
being marked separate and they win separately. If
Yes.
OG wins, then CG doesn't win.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
There's no win over here because it's first, second, third, fourth.
Yeah. I understand that. Yeah, okay. Thanks.
Yeah. So both teams will try to argue for the same motion. However, they will argue it in different ways, and you have to assess which way was better or which way was more convincing. Uh, I don't want to go into more depth because BP judging is a whole new ball game. It's very interesting. It's one of my favorite things, but I will not go into here. That's it for like the basics of adjudication. Any questions? Like anything at all?
Yeah, could you repeat exclusivity? What was that about?
Okay, exclusivity. So for example, if how do I okay, if the team suppose in an AP you have a motion, right? Government comes up and says, if the motion passes, then we will have outcome X, Y, Z, which are good. However, opposition comes up and says, listen, even if the motion does not pass, we will still have outcome X, Y, Z. So all the good things that are happening in in government's world are happening regardless of whether that motion is passing or not. At that point, government have not really made any good points simply because whatever benefits they were trying to show are not benefits that are exclusive to their side of the house, which means they don't need the motion pass for those benefits to come in the first place. So that's not a very good argument on why the motion should pass. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay, I got it.
If you're still confused, it's fine. I can explain.
No, I got it. So it's like cause and effect are not related.
Kinda, or they can be related, but even if you have the
The
opposite cause
opposition says
happening,
it is not.
no. Listen, there are 2 ways. Either you can prove that cause and effect are not related, or B, the second cause or different cause will also have the same effect. If uh, if you say that banning this thing will make it happier, will make someone happier, if you prove that even not banning it will also make them happy, then that's fine. So you're saying that even if there's a different cause, the final outcome is the same. So in exclusivity means you show that your outcome is exclusive to your side of the house. So if they're able to show that that outcome is not exclusive, regardless of what the cause is, then there's no benefit. Does that make sense?
Yeah, good. Thanks.
Good. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question about BP, Ajay.
Mm-hmm.
So if closing off, let's say, rebuts something from opening government, does that count in the weighing between opening government and closing government?
I don't know. Weighing is a very different thing. Weighing is basically showing why your arguments are important. Weighing is usually so weighing again. It depends. If it's like for example, if it's competing rebuttal, then if closing opposition offers competing rebuttal, they have to weigh their arguments and show me why those arguments are much more relevant than whatever opening government has given to me, and why opening government's benefits are not that important. But this like closing opposition competing rebuttal benefits or outcomes are much more important. Then weighing is necessary. If it's a weighing basically shows if there's anything on a comparative, which is basically you're not able to take everything on the other team down, right? So you have to show that, or like you cannot take down on what closing opposition cannot take down what opening opposition said. At that point, you have to show what's more relevant, what's more important, and that's where weighing comes in. So either there are two ways you can two reasons when you need to show, like two places when you need to show your things are more important. Number one, on the basis of opening closing, to show your arguments are more important and therefore better contributive, or on the basis of government versus opposition, if you're offering competing rebuttal. So you show that your way of doing things will lead to better outcomes. Does that make sense?
Not completely. Wait, so if opening government says we want to prove X, and closing government says we'll prove Y, and closing opposition says X, like proves that X won't happen. So when I'm comparing opening, opening government tries to prove X, closing government tries to prove Y. Closing op comes and says X will not happen, and they prove that successfully. Then when I'm comparing opening gov and closing gov, do I consider that opening government has X, or do I like take that out of that comparison?
No, you still consider opening government has X. So when you're addressing clashes between two teams, you necessarily don't bring in a third team into it.
Okay, fine.
So you still compare opening government and closing government on the basis of whether X is likely to happen, like on the basis that X is still happening.
Okay, cool.
Anything else? Any other questions? Okay, I guess there's none. If you ever have any questions, feel free to just text me. I'll be here in the meeting for a couple of minutes if you still have any. Otherwise, you're free to leave.
Thanks a lot for organizing this.
You're welcome, dude.
Do I stop the recording? I'll stop the recording, yeah? Cool.
So, is this more important? Is the argumentation session more important than this?
Depends. The argumentation session. Okay, argument.